Thank you very much. That was great. And our last speaker is Herman Rosenfeld, who is a Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly Coordinating Committee member and a former staff member of the CAW.
Thank you. I was in the CAW in the unfortunate space of the Education Department, which was given no responsibility to organize anything around the Days of Action, so we were just trying to figure out ways to insert ourselves in it. But I want to talk a little bit of what drove the Days of Action, and then to do a bit of an evaluation, and look a little bit, if I have some few moments, to try and look at how do we move in the direction of some of the things that John was talking about, which we all would agree are the goals we would like to move towards. One of the things about Harris was that's similar to today was the common sense revolution, just as the attack on the gravy train are part and parcel of this neoliberal agenda. This was an earlier version of it, and instead of the gravy, is the social welfare recipients were the ideological targets. But in general, the idea was to weaken certain roles of the state to help break and weaken the welfare state and the labor movement. And whereas today, obviously, they've made huge gains in spite of the battles we waged then. The battle in the United States for the very survival of the public sector and the trade union movement and the trade union movement itself, and the very ambitious agenda that John was describing about Ford, we all know is coming in the planks were there. A number of things that were similar about that moment, and number one is that one of the things that opened up a lot of working people voted for Harris. And a lot of that support came from their experience with social democracy that was also unable to deal with neoliberal attacks, and the so-called social contract, where a lot of workers had the conclusion that, hey, this reinforces my notion that public sector workers and public sector spending are the cause of our inability to deal with crises. And if the public sector really is to blame, why not elect somebody who will really do something about it? And for a lot of people who were frustrated with the results of the NDP, weren't politicized in other ways, Harris was a perfect example. There are various reasons why working people, certain groups of working people, certain stratum of working class people will support right-wing populists. There are reasons then and the reasons today we have to learn and study and figure out what they are by talking to people and dealing with them and responding to them. And then there was the issue of how the trade union movement actually took up some kind of battle. And as John was describing that first stage, what the hell, we didn't know there was going to be any battle at all in that first stage, and I remember thinking about that. But the nature of that response was was extraordinary, even if it was short-lived, and it was defensive. But I think it was of necessity defensive, even if a lot of us wanted it to be more. And it had a lot to do with the fact that the leadership of the trade unions and the political experience of a lot of workers, even who were wanted to engage in this, was they wanted to go back to this so-called mythological Kindler Gentile Ontario before neoliberalism, and they were fed by the notion that maybe they can get the NDP back in some kind of a way. On the other hand, a lot of people had started to break with this kind of thinking, particularly around the social contract, particularly around within certain unions, particularly in the public sector, and even in an institution where I was working in, which eventually went back to its original perspective, and that's the CAW. And the idea was to organize one-day general strikes in order to pressure employers and strikes against particular employers who in fact were supporting Harris. And that was a very important moment, because the kind of work you had to do to convince people who, in fact, many of whom voted for Harris, that they should be going on strike against their employer for a political reason against that government was a very, very important thing. It was important because it was a break with a certain notion of politics. It took certain kinds of resources, and I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about a stratum of activists who were willing and able to train to talk to other workers about what was wrong with this, why you have to strike. And they did that. And this was organized throughout the trade union movement for a while. And we talked about it calling off. And it culminated in a series of very important one-day strikes in London, where it was frigid, minus 30 degrees, and in Toronto and a number of other places. London and Toronto were, I think, the high points. They were really exciting, and they did a lot of things. As I mentioned, they convinced a lot of workers, many of whom had supported Harris, to voluntary strike employers. They organized the tactical necessities of striking employers. They made sure that strikes developed into mass demonstrations, even within some unions who had still argued that you don't want to turn people off to the NDP, so you don't want to have any strikes. and they were based upon community labor coalitions that were organized. And those were very important, at least in principle. We heard the story about what happened, that magnificent moment where the Minister of Education was on the radio and TV and had to say, well, we have to withdraw this legislation. It was a moment of possibility. It passed. And eventually the days of action petered out, as even the one-day general strikes were nothing more than people busing in from Windsor to across the Ontario, where people locally didn't want to strike at all anymore. Different people evaluate the successes and failures of the days of action. One of my favorite experiences that when any 10 of us who lived during that period will have 10 different opinions about what happened. That's interesting, but it's important. The days of action, as I said, were defensive, and that was important. Convincing workers who oppose and not support Harris's policies was an important step forward. It wasn't able to mobilize those people to do other things, but moving them was important. It was a component of them changing later on. Developing a whole stratum of worker activists to argue on these political issues was also critical, because it gave them confidence, even after the days of action, to go on and become the core of the anti-globalization movement and the labor movement, which in fact did operate. And it operated for a while. It was quite interesting. It moved from Quebec, from Windsor to other places to Quebec, where it reached a crescendo. But of course, that stratum was lost. And it actually helped to build this kind of links between, although it was not the level we needed, between people in communities, community activists, community organizations, and the labor movement. It was unbalanced. The labor movement often went in and went out as if they're cavalier, they had those resources, you do things my way or the highway. But it was a beginning of actually discussing this. And finally, the idea of the working class, some stratum of the working class having some experience of doing it, going in collective motion, mattered. It mattered in some of the unions which did support Ray and continued to. The unions which in fact opposed the strikes. The unions like the steelworkers, which started and built upon some of the workers, some of the longtime activists there, and it opened up. As people have the collective experience, it matters. It rekindled and built a little bit, at least for a while, what Alan Sears, who I had talked to about presenting this before in a very, very interesting conversation, often calls the infrastructure of dissent. But of course, a lot of the things that John described, in fact, are a reality. Harris wasn't defeated. He was reelected, and in fact, then you had a softer version, but it came in there. The divisions within the union movement were deepened, but they didn't go to the level that they needed to do in order to have the kind of political discussions you need to have, and eventually that they petered out. And the idea of a different kind of politics was never really embraced by the trade union fully. And they're still in a kind of limbo in terms of how do you deal with a situation where the traditional social democratic partner really isn't doing the work, can't do the work because of neoliberalism. Do you support like a Gompersist relationship with the existing party, like some of them do? Do you look from issue to issue, or do you just sort of drift and figure out? The community coalitions disappeared as soon as each day of action was over, leaving a mixed experience of the relationship between people, communities, and people striking. So I guess I would just sum up by saying just a couple of points in general about this. I think one thing that was missing was what John talked about, having a kind of a movement which is able to operate inside the trade unions, outside the trade unions, in communities, to be able to argue for a mass fight back, to be able to argue from an anti-capitalist perspective, but also not in an abstract way, to be able to analyze what's driving this. And third, to be able to build links between the different segments of the working class. My sense is that we aren't there. We're just forming, and this is one of the things that I've been toying in my head in terms of figuring out how can we build to contribute this kind of movement happening. Because it's not wrong to think that these things can build in ways, the mass part of it can build in ways which you can't think of beforehand. What's happening in Madison right now, I was there last summer and I was thinking, God, I went to university there 40 years ago, thinking this place is like a country club now. I don't think anything can ever happen here. And look what's happening there now. The days of action, from the first stage that John talked about to the second stage and then back to the third stage, it's a big up, down, and it's from different perspective of different periods, things seem impossible, but of course these trends are there and they can develop. But you need to have some way of influencing the process of educating workers, of mobilizing them, of getting them a sense of a kind of perspective which the leadership in the trade union movement, even the best intentioned ones, aren't going to be able to give. I'm not sure how to do that. I'm not sure how do we move to be able to do that either. It's something I think we need to talk about. And the question of the flip side of that is also to be able to argue about doing socialist education or education about the system and how, in fact, simply arguing that going back to the welfare state or going back to David Miller as an analog to going back to Bob Ray is simply not an option. Because those policies, in fact, were different ways of accepting the inevitability of relying on a simply private enterprise economy, of creating an environment where private capitalists will want to invest in shitty jobs or in the financial sector instead of creating a different kind of alternative. We have to be able to have a credible way of speaking to workers about those alternatives. If those kinds of movements were bigger and were able to operate during the Days of Action period, the outcomes might have been different. We have to work towards building those outcomes now.
Any panelists want to make closing comments or respond to the questions? Just about 2 or 3 minutes each.
That's right, no, that's fine. Just a couple of points. You know, the interesting thing about the teachers, I too saw when the teachers, when David Johnson, who was the Minister of Education, had to respond to the court ruling again. It was clearly a moment where possibility was there, and it dropped. And unfortunately, I was the last person in the CAW that they sent. It's the person they sent to confront, to explain to the Catholic teachers to talk about the Days of Action and the Harris agenda. This is right after they were betrayed. So the first couple of speakers sort of made it seem as if I was responsible for this, but afterwards they realized I was in their side, and there was a very, very angry group of militant trade unionists, and I never quite forgot that. Just want to make a couple of points. The point about new left institutions. Left institutions are not the same thing as centrist alliances with capital, like One Toronto and those kinds of things. Those things were mild social democratic efforts, and I don't think that's the kind of thing we should be involved in. Secondly, is the idea that OFL convention passes a motion for general strike, and you wonder why there wasn't a general strike. Well, you know, you throw an apple up in the air, it'll fall to the ground. The fact is that the masses of working people were not supporters of a general strike at that moment. Even if a relative handful of their representatives could pass a resolution, and some of the people who support resolution know that they wouldn't be put into practice. That's one of the ideas one of the positive ideas of that experience that I remember from the Days of Action was working on those people who in fact supported Harris and those ideas, and try and transform their ideas, try and confront their ideas, figure out ways to talk to them and move them. That's the kind of thing we need to do today. You know, not just with people who supported for it, but people who support the idea that workers shouldn't have the right to strike, or support the idea of privatization, or support the idea that only private enterprise could provide good jobs. We have to figure out ways. How do you explain to people about that? And realize that explaining is only one part, is what kind of things you have to create for people to be able to experience that makes them open to those kinds of things. Secondly, the next to last point is about Hamilton. The 100,000 demonstrators in Hamilton, most of them were not on strike. In fact, that was the thing about the Hamilton strike, is that was the steelworkers. And at that moment, and things have switched around, I realize, at that moment they negotiated with their employers, the major employers, to have a holiday. So it was only the CAW plants that went on strike, and even then they didn't do a fantastic job there. So to say that might have been the base of a bigger general strike, I don't think that was there. Although I do think that around the education piece there might have been an opening. I guess the final thing is that about Ford's opening is around Ford. We don't know. We know there's a lot of things we have to take Ford up on. We don't know which one of those is going to stick, going to resonate, or going to be a space where we can actually have some kind of way of affecting the education inside different unions. We'll see. And when they open up, like with Harris around the education, it will be there. I know one more thing. Final thing is that let's not be obsessed with tactics. I found that the thing that marked the weakening when we have no mass movement is that people walking around and said, I have the tactic that's going to shut cities down. I'll stop the trains. Well, suppose the masses of workers don't want to shut the city down. You got to convince them. The point is that we shouldn't be obsessed with the most radical, most creative tactics. Convince the workers. We're not living in an environment where the 90% or 50% or 70% of the working class is on our side but the repressed. We got to convince them. That's what we should be concentrating on.
Well, how do I follow that? I'm going to start with the question that was asked, where is Ford's weak spot? And I think, and I want to connect it to what Abby was commenting on it, because I see a connection. And actually, I can connect all kinds of things here. I think Ford's weak spot is kind of where his strength was when he was getting people to vote for him. We know that just as Harris did, he convinced people that if they vote for him, their lives are going to get better. Working class people who really are not going to see their lives getting better. The regular sort of average people who live in Toronto are not going to see things improve. What we're going to see is things are going to improve for the people who already were having things improve for them, right? So I think over the next 4 years before the next, and we can't wait for the next election before we make this point. So I think over the next 4 years, the message that has to go out is to those people who supported Ford, we need to make them regret having done that by pointing out to them on a regular basis that things, you know, how is your life better now? How are the cuts to transit going to make your lives better? How is privatizing garbage collection going to make your lives better? Because what people like Rob Ford and Mike Harris and their ilk will do, and Stephen Harper, is to divide people. They try to divide the people who should be united. And so I think the job that we have ahead of us is to continue constantly point out the strength that comes from standing together, because we have that common goal of making the world a better place, not making the lives of a handful of people better. And that connects to when Abby said, how are things better in education? Well, one of the good things that Mike Harris did, as I mentioned before, was bring teachers under the Labor Relations Act. Before, we were under something called School Boards and Teachers Collective Bargaining or something. We weren't a trade union. Now we're a trade union. I love it. There are still many teachers who would prefer to call, I'm a member of a federation. I like to say I'm a member of a union. And what happened after we came under the Trade Unions Act was the women teachers and the men teachers actually got together and formed Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, which has 76,000 members now. We are stronger because we joined together. Now, one of the dangers of that, of course, is the union bureaucracy that somebody talked about, that people who are still in the classroom sometimes don't feel that their voices are being heard by those, because there's politics in unions too, right? So I think, how do I wrap this up? I guess I just want to say the lessons learned that I learned with Harris were standing together, having a common vision and a common goal. Even though it seems like we're making a snail's pace of progress, the progress is being made, and we need to continue to do that.
Well, first of all, in what I said before, I wanted to stress how I felt the days of action fell short of what was necessary and what I believe could have been done. But I also wanted to stress the other side of things, that the days of action were the most powerful working class mobilisation in this province. They were, their potential was enormous and their impact was enormous. And when I saw the centre of the largest city in the country turned into a ghost town by the power of the working class, I realised there was something there that was absolutely incredible. So I didn't mean to in any way slander the incredible efforts and mobilisation and the thousands and thousands of people who worked on the days of action. We should always remember that side of things. The question was posed, could we have won that fight against Harris? And I actually don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if we could have won the fight against Harris, but I'll tell you a very quick story that sort of brings it home to me. After the days of action were over, there was an attack on the Employment Standards Act by the Tories, and there were meetings called by the OFL all across the province in different places. And here in Toronto, as everywhere else, they were much bigger than they'd anticipated. They were very, very big. There were lots of angry workers came out. I remember this, the last president of the OFL standing there, and and he was giving a speech, and all of a sudden somebody interrupted him with an expletive, demanding that the province be shut down. And the whole room started taking up this, shut the province down. Now, he looked horrified. He looked like a deer in the headlights. This was the most awful thing that could have happened as far as he was concerned. Now, the question has to be posed, how about if we'd have had someone standing there saying, this is magnificent, this has incredible potential, and he was thinking in terms of how can we begin to organise around this, how can we take this forward, how can we build on this? And that's, I think, really the situation. It isn't that I have this sort of notion that the workers are all revolutions on the tip of their tongue, but they're being held back by some bureaucratic shenanigans. It's much deeper than that, I understand that. But at the same time, we have to, and Sam was absolutely right, it would be ridiculous to imagine that Samuelson was going to be enthused and want to take that forward. It's down to people like us to actually intervene in a way that maximises the potential. And with regards to the present situation, what is Rob Ford's great weakness? His great weakness is that he was elected on the basis of a lie. He talks about gravy, and he's going to attack the working class, and he's going to attack poor people, and that's going to produce a mountain of anger. That he's no great thinker. I understand he communicates well through his team, but he's no great thinker. He's going to be taken aback by a movement that's going to have incredible potential. And I don't think we need to be at all conservative. I agree entirely with Paul that the focus has got to be to organise what we can on the ground right now. But we can't underestimate the potential for things to take off in a way that is absolutely dynamic. I don't make preposterous comparisons, but I imagine if you'd have gone around the streets of Cairo a few months ago and said, how about having a major mobilisation against the government here? People would have said, shut your mouth, you're mad, this could never happen. So let's understand that one thing about the austerity agenda of capitalism at the moment is it creates the potential for flare-ups and mobilisations and working class action on a scale that's unimaginable. And our role is to maximise the potential for that to happen and maximise the potential for victory. And we can do that. And I think this Workers' Assembly has been landed a situation, an opportunity that is immense. It's a great opportunity to move forward. It's a great opportunity to fail as well. And so we have to really realise that a great responsibility lies on our heads at the present time and go forward with that realisation. Thank you.